Next up, we get to hear from key policymakers on how they balance tax policies while still encouraging innovation. Yumiko Murakami, head of Tokyo Center at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, will moderate the panel. Joining us for the panel discussion are Pascal Saint-Amans, director of the Center for Tax Policy and Administration at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and Deputy Commissioner, International Investigations and Indirect Taxes Group at Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore, Chia-Tern Huey. We'll now hand the time over to Yumiko and her panel.
Hello, welcome to the very interesting and exciting session. Today, we are going to talk about digital tax, breaking down the digital tax conundrum. Why is it good for innovation? And that's the title of this session. My name is Yumiko Murakami. I'm the head of Tokyo OECD Center, and I am going to be moderating this extremely interesting panel with two, again, very exciting speakers, because they are the ones who know about this topic better than anyone in the world. So let me start off with the first speaker, Pascal Saint-Amans. Can you see us? Yes, I can see you now.
Yes.
Director of OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration. He is very kind to participate in this discussion from Paris, which is really early in the morning. You can just see it's still kind of dark there. It's 7:30 or something like that in the morning. He has been responsible for all the important developments that have taken place in the digital tax discussion, but not only digital tax discussion, but in general, we have been doing a lot of work around the global tax systems at OECD, and he is the one who makes it happen behind the scene. And also we have today Huey Chia-Tern there. Good afternoon. She's in Singapore, so a little bit better in terms of time zone. She's a deputy commissioner at the Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore. She is one of the most active and very also very useful discussants and participants in the discussions that have been taking place at OECD, but also other venues when it comes to discussions around the taxation, especially global taxation issues. So I am sure many of you today watching this session, scratching their head and thinking, what is it really? What is digital tax that we're going to talk about? So I'm going to make it very easy for you. I'm going to ask a very simple question to Pascal first. What is digital tax? What is it? Can you make it very easy for me and the audience so that we don't have to scratch my head again? Please, Pascal,
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Yumiko, and good to be with you all. It's a very easy answer. Digital tax does not exist for the time being. What do I mean by that? You have corporate income tax. Corporate income tax is the tax on profit paid by companies, including multinational companies, and multinational companies will pay corporate income tax in the countries where they operate. They will have a headquarters in Japan, they will have a center for distribution in Singapore, they will have activities in China, and they will pay taxes in Japan, in Singapore, and in China. The difficulty with digital businesses is that they can have activities in a country without being physically present. Take Google or Facebook or whatever company in the digital Rakuten, if we're in Japan, whatever company in the digital space, they may have profits in a country without being physically present. And that has triggered what we call the digital tax debate, because countries, in particular market economies, where the profit is made, because you have the consumers of the digital service or the buyers of digital goods, these countries say, we would like to tax the profits of these companies as we do tax the profits of other multinational companies. And the reason why they cannot tax these profits is that international tax rules, the way governments across the world interact with each other, international tax rules date back to the last century, the 1920s, and they provide for a country to tax a foreign company only when this foreign company has a permanent establishment, a physical presence, a fixed place of business on their territory. And we all understand that digital companies, because they have scale without mass, they can operate in a country without the need of a physical presence. And that's the tension we have currently in the international system. Do we change the rules? But we would need all the countries to allow the market jurisdictions to tax these activities. And after all, if you create a new nexus, a new right to tax without physical presence, you also need to change what we call the profit allocation rules. How much profit will you allocate to the market, which would not be limited to digital companies. So starting with the digital issue, you come up with a revision of the rules which go much beyond digital companies. So either you change the rules or you cannot change the rules, and then countries are frustrated. They're frustrated because the US or other countries don't want to change the rules, and therefore they cannot tax these companies because the tax treaties prevent them from doing so. And that's why a number of countries, France, for instance, but also Italy, the UK, Turkey, and other countries, have decided to try to tax digital through their own way. It cannot be on profit, so they go on transactions, and they introduce digital taxes, which are tolls, taxes on transactions of digital companies, of highly digitalized companies like Google, Facebook, advertisement model, or the platforms like Airbnb or Uber. So they take, like the French, 3% on all transactions, which is no longer a tax on profit. So to make short this long answer, what is a digital tax? For the time being, these are the promises or threats of digital taxes, taxes on transactions from a number of countries, which are frustrated that we do not have yet a reform of international tax, which would allow them to tax the profits of digital companies and other companies.
Well, thank you. Pascal, did you say the current international tax systems were constructed 100 years ago? Did I hear it correct?
Absolutely. The Model Tax Convention, the model on which the 3,500 bilateral treaties between countries are constructed, this model was originally drafted in 1928. Now, it's been changed since then, and the OECD's core business is to update the Model Tax Convention, but the frame has not changed. And what is challenged today is precisely this frame. It's probably time to think out of the box, out of the frame. And that's what we are trying to do with 137 members in the inclusive framework. And one of the members, guess what, is Singapore, represented by Huey.
Wow, okay. So I didn't hear it wrong. 100 years ago, we actually constructed this tax system with which we are still trying to run our economies. That must be a little bit of a challenge. So let's move on to Huey. I would like to ask you a question that's more relevant to perhaps our Asian audience. So Pascal described what this digital tax is all about. What does that really mean to you and me? We're in Asia, you're in Singapore. A lot of the audience today are probably based in Asia. What does that mean to our region? What does it mean to Singapore?
Yeah. Thank you, Yumiko. I should say that yes, indeed, digital service tax, as we have heard about, is really something that we have seen being proposed in a number of the EU member states. And more recently, we've heard the announcement from Canada. Essentially, as what Pascal mentioned, it is really about saying, me as a country, as a jurisdiction, I want to levy a tax. I want to collect a tax on another company that is selling into Singapore, even though it has no presence. So essentially, it is a domestic decision of a country whether they want to impose a tax like that. So in Asia, yes, it's equally for governments and for countries to decide whether they want a tax like that. We'll talk about the implications of such a tax later. So in our region, I should highlight that by and large, what most Asian countries have done is to deal with remote selling of services into a country by way of the consumption tax, which is, you tax, you levy a tax, but the incidence of the tax falls on the consumer. So this is to be distinguished from a digital service tax, as is commonly mentioned today, which is a tax on the gross revenue of the company that is selling the digital services. So that's a quick take. And I should also highlight. I mustn't let this opportunity pass, since Pascal mentioned it. He said that in let's say if the country chooses to levy a digital service tax, I think he has framed it as well, there is profit in the market jurisdiction. And I should say that this is really indeed a fundamental point that is being debated and discussed. And it is a question of how do we, what is a fair basis of looking at the new international tax rules, and how do we share the taxing rights?
Thank you, both of you, to explain what we're talking about today, which obviously is impacting all of us in different ways, but in particular companies. Quite frankly, today when you talk about business activities, pretty much everything has to do with digital activities in one way or another. So clearly, very important topic here. But we would also like to talk about the fact that this is not bilateral discussion. This is a very much global discussion that we are trying to promote here, which maybe, maybe that's a common sense today, because we know that a lot of companies, a lot of countries are so interlinked today. But it wasn't the case 100 years ago, probably. I'm sure there are bilateral situations, but I would imagine situations were much simpler, I would imagine. And today it's a lot more complicated. So now, next question to you, both of you, is how do you go about in terms of making sure the discussion that you are promoting is global? In other words, how do you make sure different countries, depending on the state of economies, depending on the kind of a social framework that each country has, they have a very different sort of value systems and social systems. And yet, this has to be a global discussion. This cannot be bilateral, because that would be just too complicated. So the question to you, Pascal, first of all, is how to make sure that all countries can participate in this global discussion to make sure that the framework that we're trying to come up with is going to be truly global. And what are the ways, as OECD, you are actually trying to promote to make sure this is not going to be a discussion among a selected group of countries, perhaps developed economies? What are the things that you're seeing on that front, Pascal?
Thank you, Yumiko. This is quite simple. What we have established in tax over the past 10 years, because 10 years ago with the global financial crisis, there has been a change of governance, and international tax has become an important topic for the leaders of the G20. So instead of dealing with these issues just among the club of the developed countries, which is the OECD, Japan being one of the first members of the OECD, we have enlarged the discussion to all interested countries. It started 10 years ago with what we call the Global Forum on Transparency, the end of bank secrecy, where we today have 161 members on an equal footing in the body. And in 2012, 2013, we launched a new layer of work, which was called BEPS, for base erosion and profit shifting. And that work was about trying to introduce some form of tax regulation for the taxation of multinational companies. And we have established an inclusive framework bringing all interested countries on an equal footing to implement the BEPS measures. There were 15 measures, but also to keep negotiating new standards. And when we're talking about fixing the digital challenges or the challenges of the digitalization of the economy, we're talking about establishing new standards, and that's the mandate of the inclusive framework. So this inclusive framework, which was created in Japan, in Kyoto, in 2016, this inclusive framework today includes 137 members, all OECD member countries, all G20 member countries, and all interested countries which want to participate to the discussion, which want to have a say in the discussion. Singapore is one of them. Singapore is, of course, an extremely important country in that game because it's an investment hub. So it's a country where you have a lot of investment, which is made in Asia and in the rest of the world. And Singapore is also a player in the G20, but it's just one of the 137 members where the conversation is taking place.
So to Pascal's point, in terms of equal footing and the inclusive framework that, we actually have been trying to promote, in reality, Huey, I want to ask you a question. In reality, does it really work when you are dealing with countries that are at the different stages of economic development? Especially in Asia, we see a country like Singapore, highly developed, but there are other countries in Asia which are not at the same stage of economic development. So when we talk about an inclusive framework and equal footing, in reality, is it really that easy? Aren't there issues and challenges because of different stages of economic development?
It's fair to say that in any multilateral discussions, the process will not be an easy one. That's realistic. However, in the case of an inclusive framework that is set up to deal with BEPS and how do we, what kind of new international tax rules are we going to formulate? The process, I think, is working as well as any multilateral forum can possibly be for a few reasons. Because one is a structure. The structure is such that there are two different levels at which the conversation takes place. One is a very technical level at which Singapore is quite well represented as well. And this is where we do a lot of heavy lifting in the technical discussions. And then there is another level, which is a steering group level, which is a more policy-oriented level, which, Pascal and his team has also taken care to assemble a group of jurisdictions with interests that are representative of the economic profile. And so discussions occur at the two different levels. And it is facilitated by the fact that OECD has a pretty strong institutional capacity in tax. Yeah.
Okay. So again, being very sort of candid, what are the hardest challenges Pascal, when you get up in the morning, you go to work and you're like, oh, I got to deal with this again. As a head of tax office here at OECD, I'm sure there are a lot of headaches. But, when it comes to digital tax, what are the most challenging situations that you would identify, from your seat, from your position in terms of promoting the digital tax debate?
There are many challenges. The first of them is you deal with sovereign countries. They are sovereign from a tax perspective. They are sovereign in the international framework, and therefore they may decide not to join. Now you have different countries. You have smaller countries, bigger countries, and you have countries like the US or China or Japan. And of course, as most of the multinational companies will be headquartered in a handful of countries, and in particular in the US. And as we know, the US has a quite peculiar relationship with the rest of the world, whatever the administration is. They have a quite unilateral vision of the world. It's not easy to get the US on board on a conversation, especially as given the divided government, which is organized by the constitution of the US, where the executive branch cannot commit the legislative branch, unlike in many other countries where you have an alignment between executive and legislative. It's quite difficult to bring the US to be part of the solution, and they must be part of the solution, because without them, given that most of the multinational companies are American companies, it's very difficult. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is technical. You need to find the right technical answers, which should be balanced. There are a number of countries which are frustrated, they want to tax companies, but this must be done in a principled manner. If you don't follow principles, then you may quickly have something like chaos. And Huey is very good at reminding the inclusive framework that we need principled approaches. So that's another dimension of the challenge. Finally, and you mentioned that this, Yumiko, you have very different countries with very different interests. You have market jurisdictions, you have exporting countries, you have investment hubs, you have developing countries, and each of these countries will have a different view. What my job is to keep them together, and not only to talk, but also to walk together, to walk towards a solution. So it's a bit like herding cats. It's difficult, and sometimes you get scratched here and there. But what is at stake is keeping the international community together, keeping cooperation, which is the best way to offer multinational companies tax certainty, to offer a more secure tax environment together with fairness, so that the people, the woman and the man in the street, may not have the feeling that it's all the taxes are on them and not on multinational companies. So you need to find the right balance there. It's not easy, but the political stakes are very high, which gives us some confidence that countries will make the necessary efforts to keep that negotiation going on, and at some point to be concluded.
Okay, thank you. So as Pascal said, at the end of the day, this issue comes down to individual country. Each country is independent, and each country has different value systems and social systems, and quite frankly, they may not be perfectly aligned on the international platform. But we kind of have to make sure there is going to be some framework with which, if not all, hopefully all, but most countries around the world can work together. So I would like to go to Huey just to talk about Singapore, just to talk about Singapore situation only, just for a moment, just because we've been talking about a global element for the last 20 minutes. So in the Singaporean context, again, we're talking about just your country, the digital tax reform, where are you now, and where do you see it's going? And what are the upside good things that can come with the digital tax reform that's going to take place or that's taking place in Singapore? And what about the potential downside or challenges? I know it's a big question. I'm sorry to ask you a long question, but whatever you can share, your thought would be very interesting.
Yeah, let me try to sort of reframe. When say, digital tax reform. If I suppose that's against the context of what we see in Europe with the EU, some of the EU member states levying digital service tax. Now, in the case of Singapore, no, we are not implementing any of these unilateral measures in taxing digital services. What we have is a consumption tax or GST on digital services, which is common across the world, in Europe as well as in Asia. So this conversation that is going on internationally on rewriting the international tax rules, and this, at the end of the day, as Pascal said, this is about the sharing of taxing rights, and so what are we guided by? In our view, the conversation or the dialogue should be guided or should be geared with a view to a new set of rules that will continue to encourage or support economic dynamism and growth, right? We think that the dialogue ought not result in a situation where countries are sacrificing growth for revenue, for tax revenue. We should be, if we come to a consensus, we hope to see a set of rules that will continue to reward companies for the functions they have undertaken and for the risk that they have undertaken and for the innovation that they have undertaken. So in the next few months, the discussions will be important, and we'll continue to engage in the multilateral forum, and we are committed to the ongoing discussions. You will see from the documents that's published in the public domain now that there is a sort of a conceptual basis for taxing digital services. And in any case, the conversation has also shifted beyond just taxing digital services. But in any case, the conceptual basis is really about how you tax a company that doesn't have a presence in the market, and the consensus, or we're moving towards the consensus as regarding that there is a so-called nexus to tax when that company that's selling remotely into the market has an active or significant or sustained engagement with the market. So this is a very important point, because we don't want the new international tax to be one where it allows a market country to be taxing the revenue or even the income just purely on the basis of mere sales. When there is no active, significant engagement with the market, there ought not to be any taxing right per se. So that really is quite important from the design perspective, because we are really talking about taxing the income of companies, and it is not. It has to be distinguished from a consumption tax system, where the bigger the market, the larger the consumption, the higher the amount of tax, because, well, that's a consumption tax, and that should be left to the job of VAT or GST. But in the case of the new international tax rules on digital service tax, we should be thinking about it in terms of taxing on a net basis on the income, and to be able to give recognition for current year losses and for past year losses. It is important from the company's perspective if we are going to ensure that the new tax rules continue to promote economic growth and innovation.
Thank you. I mean, it's so true that now, we've been working remotely. By the way, OECD, we've been working remotely for the last how many months? I don't know. It's something like almost 10 months or so. Looks as if it's going to be the case for a little longer, and I'm sure it's the same with many other countries. Japan is a little bit more relaxed, but still. And I think this really goes to show you how quickly our economy is being digitized. It's been going on for a while, but I think the coronavirus crisis really has, put a lot more pressure in terms of how quickly we transform ourselves, not only just the day-to-day activities, but in business models. And I think the digital taxation, digital tax discussion really needs to pick up a lot of momentum and speed, because I mean, as we're doing this, we're doing digital. Three of us are just, doing this from three different locations, which is now the reality. So I think the reality check number one, it is this is the world we live in, and the coronavirus really kind of pushed this new reality at a much faster pace in terms of how quickly it's moving. So I want to actually touch upon the innovation side of discussion, because this is part of the panel discussion. We've been talking a lot about the rule making from a regulatory perspective, perhaps for global community here. But what do you think is the impact in terms of the digital global digital tax scheme might have on the general, I would say, culture to promote innovation and new companies in particular? Pascal, do you have any thought that you could potentially share on this question?
Yeah, it's not an easy question, actually. Huey rightfully said that we shouldn't sacrifice growth for revenue. And that's the OECD recommendation for countries facing the wall of debt. Debt will increase massively because governments have to pay for people to stay at home during the COVID crisis. And the recommendation, the economic recommendation by the OECD is don't rush to fiscal consolidation, don't try to collect taxes now to consolidate, rather promote growth. However, at the same time, we can see that growth now is also threatened by the lack of trust of people in globalization. You can see a backlash. You have had growth, globalization, but in many countries at the cost of jobs, at the cost of the standard of living. And that's what you can see in European countries, but look, in the US as well. You have a backlash against globalization. And one way of limiting that backlash is to have what people would call a fairer tax system, which means, from an international perspective, a better allocation of taxing rights. So you need to be careful that you design a system which will support growth on the one hand, but which will not face a backlash on the other hand. And this is what we are trying to do by building more tax cooperation for countries to better implement their own sovereignty. Singapore has its own tax system, and it fits Singapore's social needs. France has a completely different system, or so has Japan. What is important is that each sovereignty can implement its own set of legislation on tax, which is designed to fund its social model. And what we have seen over the past 20 years is that globalization, or 30 years, globalization has undermined the real sovereignty of countries. And this is what we are trying to restore with some form of tax cooperation. If we don't do it, the risk we face is that countries will take unilateral measures. They will protect their sovereignty in an aggressive manner instead of a coordinated manner. And I think this is the challenge. What is the trade-off between supporting growth, and Huey is absolutely right, but at the same time, supporting long-term growth by making sure that countries don't close themselves down against globalization, which would be no longer sustainable. And that's where the situations are very different between Singapore, Germany, developing countries, the US, and a few other countries. And that's one of the challenges we are facing in the inclusive framework of the OECD.
The question of trust, very heavy, very important. Women, I would love to just pick a brain in terms of how you think about this question of trust, especially from the regulatory perspective. You know, as you said, balance between growth and also the needs for regulations, and there has to be this question of trust. You have to have a trust, from the business community, from industries. They need to be able to say, yes, this is a fair system. We can live with it and grow business at the same time. Do you have any thought in terms of what you hear, from your, from your counterparts in the business world in terms of what they want to see in you when it comes to trust?
Yeah. I think first of all, we agree that for the solution, for the consensus solution for the long term, the work has to be sustainable, has to consider fair, equitable sharing of taxing rights between countries, and also consider the perspectives of the businesses. The current situation is far from desirable, because in a landscape where different countries choose to implement their own form of a digital services tax, it make for a very fragmented landscape that makes it difficult for businesses, because each country will have their own form of a way of defining what's taxable and what's not. So it's extremely complicated. It can result in overtaxation and a lot of tax uncertainty. Hence, I think the promising direction we're seeing are countries willing to come together to forge a new consensus. So that is the first step towards building trust. And we are very committed to the process of coming to eventual consensus solution. So that's important. And second, when it comes to the sharing of taxing rights, yes, different countries will have different policies. And on the one hand, there's a revenue needs. On the other hand, we must always remember that we should be guided by the direction that the environment should continue to support growth and enterprise. And to our mind, in our view, in a fair and equitable system will be one where, yes, if there is a global consensus to allocate more taxing rights to the markets, it should remain that the location, the jurisdiction, or the country that hosts the company will continue to enjoy the majority of the profits, or the taxing rights to the majority of the profits. Because after all, it is that host country that provides the institutions and institutional support, the environment, and the infrastructure for the company. And of course, the company where substantive activities are, that would be the place where the majority of the profit should continue to reside. So to our mind, we should be thinking of growing the pie and coming to a system where there is where it recognizes what digitalization has done to all our economies, and for this to be sustainable, the views of the perspectives of the businesses are important, and businesses ought to be also looking contributing to the consultation that is ongoing right now. But top on our mind in this whole process is also about a future system that considers giving fostering an environment where businesses can have early certainty. So, where businesses have clear, transparent mechanisms where they can have clarity, early certainty on what the tax treatment might be. That helps to create trust between the businesses and the governments as well, and trust in the process. And second, important for businesses, which is critical as well, is that there must be an effective dispute resolution system. Again, this must be a transparent process that businesses can avail themselves of. So again, this the infrastructure for creating such a mechanism will also be something that engender trust. But supporting all this, underlying all this, if the new rules come to pass and we are still completely engaged in the conversation, is that we also believe that there must be a consistent application of the rules across different countries, because once the new rules are being knocked out and countries agree to the new rules, they must abide by the new rules, and we can oblige countries to commit to the new rules by way of a multilateral mechanism again. So this is agreed to be bound by a common set of rules and agreement to implement them consistently. It will also help engender trust in the entire ecosystem.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we are running out of time. So I just wanted to finish with my last question. Actually, this one is for Pascal. Can you just tell us what we can expect in terms of what is likely to happen to the agreement, the timeline? What does 2021, what is it going to bring to you or to us?
Well, first, we have to recognize that the deadline was by the end of 2020. We have 3 weeks left, and we will not deliver a consensus-based solution by the end of the year. However, the inclusive framework, when it met in October, virtually, agreed that we had done a good job, that we had a solid basis, and the work we do is in 2 pillars. So we have blueprints for each pillar, and the inclusive framework, but also the G20 recognize that this is a solid basis for a future agreement. And we have reset the calendar, and we have a new deadline, which is mid-21. So we have to deliver a solution by mid-21. Our countries will do what Huey has described, unilateral measures. Now, the big question mark is, what will be the position of the new US administration? We don't know yet. They're not yet in office. We'll know as soon as they are appointed, as soon as they can take decision. What we know is that this is now a political issue. It's been escalated to the level of finance ministers, of leaders. I think President-elect Biden will hear from President Macron, Chancellor Merkel, or other leaders in the world that there must be a solution. So we need to wait and see what the US position will be, because it's quite important in that conversation. All the other countries in the world, I think, being in the mindset of let's reach a deal. So we'll see in the coming weeks. Immediately, what we have, women refer to it, is a public consultation closing down next week on the 14th of December. So we invite all businesses, all stakeholders, NGOs to comment on this. We will debrief the comments in January so that we can fine-tune the blueprints, resume the negotiation, and hopefully reach an agreement by mid-21.
Well, thank you. I think 2021 is going to be...
We do apologize for the previous session where we had to cut that abruptly, as we have to move on to the next session now. Artificial intelligence is a term that most of us are familiar with, but what are the practical implementations for artificial intelligence, and what are we seeing the use cases trending in? Well, Chan Yu-im from Channel News Asia will be moderating the fireside chat with Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, chairman of Sinovation Ventures, in order to find out about key developments in today's artificial intelligence industry. Well, I'll now pass the time over to Yu-im and Dr. Lee.
All right, hello, I'm Chan Yu-im, editor and presenter at Channel News Asia. Thank you very much for joining us today. Now, the focus of today's session is the new AI imperative, from scientific discovery to the age of implementation, which is apparently where we are at right now. So I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Kai-Fu Lee. He is chairman of Sinovation Ventures. It's a venture capital firm that invests in AI technology. And Dr. Lee is one of the world's most respected leaders in the field of artificial intelligence, and he is one of the founders as well. So Dr. Lee, thank you very much for joining us today. Let's have a look at 2020 in retrospect. It's been nearly a year since whispers that something might be amiss began to emerge from Wuhan, and now we're living in a vastly different world. Everyone is getting used to coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. Our behavior has changed as well. So a lot of us work from home, we play, we study, we do everything. It's all digital. And all of this internet activity is feeding into AI machines, which means that they're learning, they're getting smarter, they're getting quicker. You've already said that in the past 2 to 3 years, AI implementation and adoption has vastly bolted ahead. So if we use that as a reference, how would the gains in 2020 alone compare, Dr. Lee?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to the conference. AI is a technology that relies almost exclusively on data. Having a large amount of data is paramount to having a successful AI implementation. And the data needs to be large in quantity, structured, labeled, connected to some business result. So it's traditionally, internet has been the space in which this kind of data has been available, whether it's Facebook trying to maximize user minutes or Amazon trying to figure out what other products to suggest that you buy. AI is the technology that's used to target you for the specific items to maximize its business result. So the natural progression would have been for AI to be adopted in other businesses with large amounts of data, such as fintech, what we're talking about here, and also government, retail, manufacturing. And then AI is also gaining quickly on the ability to understand speech and images and vision, and then of course autonomous vehicles and robot. So that's kind of the technology roadmap. What COVID has done is really accelerated the digitization. As we know, our old workflow, right, going to work is all that analog. It's not digitized. It's not stored. It's not analyzed. You know, it's us walking around in the real world. Our meetings are not always recorded. But I think COVID having to need to create a work environment that allows for remote workers and working at home, it has really streamlined and digitized the work. Similarly, meetings such as this one has also become digitized. So this rapid stage of online and digitization creates the data infrastructure, I think, for a much faster adoption of AI. That means the analysis of work streams. That means figuring out what types of work might be outsourced and doable by AI. It also means potentially AI can be used to be a part of these meetings, such as taking notes, such as searching notes. So everything you ever say, you now have to be accountable for. And also AI can become a virtual customer service agent, because you could be looking at me like you do now, but I could be a robot responding to your customer service queries or trying to make sales. And the list goes on. And then this will disrupt and change not just work, business, conferences, meetings, but also, of course, entertainment, education. So this will have a large spillover effect. The other aspect where AI has a big impact is in the robotics, because the need to socially distance in warehouses, in factories, the adoption of robots, especially in China, has been very, very rapid. And that includes for moving items in factories and warehouses, for picking, and also for visual inspection, as well as for some assembly. That's a little bit tougher. But that is now also spilling over into other commercial use. In many restaurants now in China, it is not a waiter who brings the food, but a robot. The robot is not humanoid. It's more like a tray that knows how to take the food to each table, where the person who ordered the food takes it off as a means of minimizing contact. So I think really AI is blossoming everywhere. And of course, healthcare is a final area that we all know is AI is being used for contact tracing. AI will be used in the future for predicting pandemic. AI is being used to assist in the vaccine and drug discovery process. So I believe the pandemic has an unintended consequence of dramatically accelerating the adoption of AI.
Dr. Lee, in a very short period of time amid COVID, many people have lost their jobs, and many companies have also had to digitize in order to survive. So here in Singapore, for example, government policy is to help firms to retain jobs, to keep workers. There's also a lot of help for businesses to embark on their digital transformation journey and, of course, train their workforce in tandem as well. Still, though, Dr. Lee, it remains a challenge for some traditional businesses who seem afraid or unwilling to digitize because they just don't understand the nuts and bolts of it. So from a survival of the fittest point of view, what is the cost of not going digital for businesses?
Well, it's very similar to not embracing the internet. In the beginning, people might think they can continue to do what they do. Other people are not doing it. But two things will happen. One is for some businesses, for some industries, there will be companies that tries to disrupt existing players. For example, online AI-based insurance or loan compared to traditional ways of doing these things. That will be one big threat and challenge. That will have companies that have a brand new way of doing everything online using AI. So it has no cannibalization, no baggage, and much lower cost structure. And that will seriously threaten companies that don't embrace AI and technology. The other is traditional companies. Some will embrace AI first and will gain either a margin advantage or a cost advantage. And that will be the other form that will provide a front and back squeeze on the companies that are slow to embrace AI. I'm not saying every company must embrace AI, but companies that have a lot of data and the data connects to a business result and it has either competitors in the same market or potential digital disruptors. These are going to be the first set of companies, I think, that will face these challenges. And if you look at the companies that were too slow to embrace the internet, most of them are out of business. And AI is really the next big disruptor, platform level after the internet. So please heed the advice that you really need to consider this, embrace it, adopt it early, be an early adopter so that you won't be squeezed in both ways.
And Dr. Lee, you said that the fintech sector is perfectly suited to AI, or that AI is perfectly designed for fintech. Could you explain this a little bit? And how can governments and regulators encourage entities in this space to adopt more AI technology?
Certainly. The way AI works is you take a large amount of data, and then you use that data based on actual outcomes to make smart decisions. So, for example, you can take a look at a lot of people who borrowed money and try to teach an AI system to determine what kind of a person with what kind of a background and data is likely to default versus repay. Similarly, with credit card, detect what kind of a particular usage pattern and the user background is likely to be fraudulent versus non-fraudulent. All the companies you invest in, AI can be used to alert issues and trigger potential problems, but also you can teach an AI system to find inefficiencies and in the marketplace and find companies that will provide higher returns. So data science is often the first step to help humans gain the insight, but then later AI is a much better way to make decisions because AI can take into account so many more variables. When people tend to look at if then else as ways of reasons to make an investment or to approve or disapprove a loan, AI can take into consideration many peripheral elements. So it's a much better informed, higher accuracy compared to the human. And also AI can potentially target each person with something different so that it can look at, for some people, it might look at certain features about giving a loan. For other people, it might look at other features. So it's not a standard one-size-fits-all. So these are the reasons why fintech why AI is a good fit for financial industries, because there's a lot of data and there are certain results. You always know at the end of the day if someone returned a loan or not, if the credit card use was fraudulent or not, if an investment made money or lost money. And these become very accurate, grand truth to label the data so as to help AI learn to separate the two types of outcomes. So financial data is also all virtual, all human created, as opposed to if you want to automate an assembly line, you got to find ways to fit in the robot and have it work with people and all these complex things. If you want to fit it into manufacturing, you have to figure out how it fits in the supply chain, how the packaging is done. It's a lot of physical things. Financial is all virtual. So in that sense, it's very similar to the internet. So if you look at how much AI has disrupted and improved and helped internet giants make so much more money, that same opportunity exists in fintech.
And Dr. Lee, let's turn to the topic of responsible AI. So the current discussion is very much focused on rules and regulations when it comes to safeguarding data, issues of privacy, and of course a lot of governments are taking this very seriously. But where do you see perhaps a tug of war happening between regulation and allowing innovation to flourish in the industry?
Right. I believe regulation is certainly needed because AI is powerful, is a very powerful tool. Used by the good guys, it can create value. Used by the bad guys, they can do bad things with it as well. And also, AI is a new technology. As with any new technology, the first applications are inevitably going to find unanticipated problems. And that's why we see a lot of concerns about use of AI in the areas of privacy issues, bias, fairness, and explainability, and security. So these are some of the things that really frighten people, and rightfully, understandably so. I do think regulations are needed to protect users in the appropriate places. But I would also say equally important are using technologies to prevent wrongful technology use. For example, a lot of the bias fairness problems, like AI that has chosen to interview fewer women because they didn't have enough women in their databases, or not recognizing African Americans because not having enough databases. I would say that to reduce such cases of bias and unfairness, one could build tools that can detect data that's insufficient or data that is likely to lead to bias and alert the programmer, or even disallow the programmer from building a program on such biased data. But also training the engineers to realize their responsibility is not just to write a piece of code, but the code will be used to interview people. So you'll be potentially writing software that will create unfair situations. And then if you extend that to autonomous vehicles, which could hit people, autonomous diagnosis engines that could give the wrong diagnosis, the responsibility on AI engineers is huge. So I think educating people to understand the responsibility so that they take it seriously, provide good tools, have technologies for detecting, avoiding, fixing, are also part of the repertoire of things we need to do, in addition to the regulations.
Dr. Lee, do you think there'll be one day a global standard for the ethical use of AI, or do you think rules will have to be tailored by country and by culture?
I think it will have to be different by country because I don't think initially these will be AI laws or even data laws. They will basically be built on existing laws, right? People who use AI for fraudulent use will be punished by the existing laws around fraud. People who basically steal data or sell data that doesn't belong to you will be basically punished the same way as people who steal cars and steal other physical properties and give it to people. So people who break into other people's AI and alter systems and alter outcomes will be punished the way that hackers who break into systems and damage computer equipment and hurt user experience. So I think existing laws will first be used and applied for the misuse of AI to cause damage to other people. And as we all know, the way one punishes IP or privacy or fraud are different country to country. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all, but there are similar underlying value, but I think the actual punishment and the enforcement will be different country to country.
And moving ahead, as AI seeps into our everyday lives, do you think the issue of privacy will become less and less of a concern as more people get used to how it functions and they get to know it better, they understand it?
I believe this will likely evolve. I think right now, in some of the developing countries, people are enjoying the convenience so much, they're being less worried about privacy. I think that's an issue. Greater awareness is needed and greater protection by the governments for the relatively less experienced and naive users. But also, I think in some of the developed countries, a few egregious efforts, events and news, such as the Cambridge Analytica news, I think is perhaps raising people's alarm too much. So much so that people are proposing very extreme countermeasures that I think will end up backfiring. Yes, Facebook and Cambridge Analytica caused some problems, but it's probably not a solution to break up Facebook into multiple companies. There should be better ways about punishing basically data exchange and sell of data without consent. There should be ways to deal with that as opposed to jumping to the extreme. But I think people will over time grapple with and figure out ways where government can protect the most egregious types of infringement. I also think there will be people who will feel there's so much convenience, they're willing to give away some privacy. But I think it's important to realize, first, it may be different, a little bit different country to country. Second, a certain level of consumer understanding and advocacy is needed. And thirdly, even within one country, there will be people who view privacy as something that is something that's extremely important and highest priority and not willing to compromise. But there will be also other people who will say, hey, look, we live in a world where there's not going to be too much privacy at the end of the day, and the convenience we get is good enough as long as the laws are protecting us from the most egregious uses. So the end user needs to have some options about really going to the extreme to protect privacy, or being able to exchange to some extent privacy or data for convenience and security and other benefits.
And Dr. Lee, earlier you mentioned the role of research and the developers and all of this, and there are a lot of ethical challenges that remain. So there's fairness, there's explainability, data provenance, and robustness as well. How is this being addressed in the AI community at the moment? Should developers be bearing the responsibility of the products or how the product is used by the client? Or is the attitude more, I create this and it's really not up to me how it's used or how the data is used or how the algorithms are used?
The AI community have gathered together and come up with a number of basically rules of engagement and AI ethics policies. Some companies, Google, Microsoft, and others have come up with some. Also, some of the AI community that have formed. I'm a part of the World Economic Forum AI Council, and we are developing a certain set of guidelines. And there are other entities, such as Partnership for AI, that are doing that. So the AI community is doing some of this. And I think some governments are also coming up with different laws that protect the data and that punish people who break such laws. And China has had pretty strong laws about companies selling data without consent to another company. They're actually very significant punishment. Europe has developed a GDPR. I think at the end of the day, it's really the first time we're seeing huge benefit from AI, but also large challenges. So I think we have to allow for different organizations, different companies, and different governments to try different rules and regulations and really watch and study and survey what's going on so that each country and each company can develop the best laws and the best products and the internal practices that protect the users and give users some degree of choice.
And Dr. Lee, despite the promise of vaccines, there's still a lot of uncertainty and disruption that's going to be carried over into 2021. So let's try to crystal ball this a little bit. As AI increasingly generates real economic value through its application across many industries, especially traditional ones, where do you predict we'll see inroads and breakthroughs in the next 6, 12, or maybe 18 months?
I think in the short term, the Western world is beginning to see the benefit that China has enjoyed for some time about the use of mobile payment and digital currency. For many years, I've had friends in US and Europe not fully understand what the big deal is with Alipay and WeChat Pay. I think the pandemic actually very interestingly, because people are trying not to pass on credit cards to each other for the fear of getting the virus. So people have moved to the digital payment. And it's kind of a strange reason that leads to the same outcome. So we're now seeing in the US products like Square's Cash App and PayPal really growing in popularity. And then they're now offering, so once you have a digital wallet, I think you will begin to see the benefits are tremendous because you can use that for investment, for loans, for insurance, and that will make new kinds of entrepreneurial efforts a lot easier. We're seeing in China, the entire shopping experience is now different because of digital payment. The entire online to offline, the food delivery has completely changed. The Chinese people have completely changed the way that we eat. So I think these dividends that China has been enjoying, US and Europe will soon enjoy also because of the pervasiveness and the inevitability for digital payment to become the #1 payment method, much higher, much better than cash, and also better than credit card. And the spillover effects will be quite significant because in China now, I think we're moving kind of to the next level. We're seeing the online behavior and the digital payment really changing the future of online retail, online education, and online entertainment. New forms are coming out, and online e-commerce. Commerce is now come quite a bit different. We're seeing a reinvention of TV shopping, now recast as live streamed e-commerce shows. It might sound kind of unusual, but imagine anything you buy, you can just click on the phone. Then the most wonderful way to sell a product or browse is to have celebrities or KOLs that have a lot of trusted followers, and then they would then sell products that they believe themselves and convince their followers to buy. And then when they became big stars, they can build their own brand. So over time, the e-commerce we're seeing in China, the product concept, product development, product manufacturing, sales, marketing, channels, KOL, celebrities, spokesperson, all become streamlined online and digital. There are even products that were first marketed and then developed. A beverage in China was tested first to see what kind of packaging color, name, sugarless content versus milk versus what's in it, who should you sell it to, who's a better KOL, to be a spokesperson. When they decide all that, they come back and say, okay, let's design a drink because now we know this drink will sell well. So that ability to connect all of these parts of product development all the way to sales dramatically shortens the product cycle and reduces the likelihood of failure. And I think this will take us to new heights. And the very important foundation is digital payment. And China has been building on this for the last 6 or 7 years. And I think we're seeing US really starting to catch on as well.
All right, Dr. Lee, that's all the time we have. Thank you very much for your insights. A real pleasure speaking with you. And that was Dr. Kai-Fu Lee, Chairman of Sino-Innovation Ventures. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee and Yum for the engaging conversation around artificial intelligence. Now, AI applications, that's what the topic has been about. It is a hot topic, especially for financial services. But one thing is for sure, AI is rapidly reshaping the business landscape of the financial industry. All kinds of digital assistants and apps will continue to perfect themselves thanks to cognitive computing. Now, this will make managing personal finances exponentially easier, since the smart machines will be able to plan and execute short and long-term tasks, from paying bills to preparing tax filings. We can also expect to see better customer care that uses sophisticated self-help virtual reality systems.